Thank you very much for coming here. So, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about something I started calling Web Meets World. And it has a couple of different meanings. I'm going to focus on one of them today. And that is, the real world that's starting to intrude on all of us and making us think, what do we do next? So, let me just, start. There was a column by Dan Lyons who came into prominence as fake Steve Jobs, but is now just a regular Newsweek columnist. And he ended his column about the current financial troubles affecting, the startup economy, and he said, Web 2.0, is it becoming Web 2.over? And, it's a question that I imagine a lot of you might be asking, certainly as I've been doing interviews with press. That's one of the questions that they're all asking. And I answer, wait a minute, think about the deep trends, behind Web 2.0. The internet becoming a platform for software development, the power of the web to harness collective intelligence, new database-backed applications that really show the power of databases that grow through increasing returns of user participation and network effects. Software above the level of a single device. That is, software that literally is interpenetrating our lives more and more through the devices we carry. Software as a service. These are not going away. They're not short-term trends. They're not going to be affected by the ups and downs of financial markets. Do you really think that we're done yet with exploiting this huge change to the network as platform? I don't. So that's sort of a first order answer to that question. But there's a second order answer. There will be winners and losers. Certainly there'll be some big winners in any business that helps to save money. Cloud computing, software as a service applications like Google Apps. Already you see a lot of momentum towards free applications. This is going to continue. Of course, so that's actually very helpful for Web 2.0, although the downside is some of those applications are already taken by the big guys. And I'll be quite honest with you, I've actually predicted for a long time that we were entering a period of consolidation in Web 2.0 applications. If you look at the history of technology, every time there's a new platform, there's an explosion. There's a literal explosion of companies that deliver goods, services, new ideas in that new marketplace, and most of them don't survive. So when people have said, well, gosh, what's going to happen in this financial downturn? I say, well, it's probably going to accelerate the winnowing process that was going to happen anyway. So much of what I've thought about Web 2.0 and open source has really come from studying the history of the IBM personal computer. And I'm old enough, I'm sad to say, to remember, what was happening in the early 80s. There were thousands of PC software companies. And by the early 90s, there were only a few. And, Microsoft basically took over the world. And there were some big roll-up plays, companies like Computer Associates and Symantec that bought lots and lots of little companies and became big through accretion. And there were a few other winners, on both the hardware and the software side. But, that Precambrian explosion of PC startups didn't go on forever. And Web 2.0 startups in that sense are not going to go on forever. But startups didn't end. And there were new opportunities. New opportunities came along with the web. And so I think we have to really think about where we're going. And I really do think there's going to be some big winners, as I said, continuing with the trend. And I also want to point out that something that happened in the dot-com bust back in 2001. One company that I was very close to, Blogger.com, we were a founding investor in Evan Williams' company. Evan used to work for me at O'Reilly. And we were on the board, and we eventually helped Evan sell the company to Google. But in the low point for Blogger, it was down to Evan, sleeping, under his desk. One guy keeping his dream alive. And there may be startups that will survive that way because, hey, the cheap, easy venture capital isn't there, but you believe so passionately in what you're doing that you want to make it stick. And that's actually a good time for entrepreneurs in a lot of ways. The losers are going to be Me Too startups fueled by easy money and the venture capitalists who invested in them. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be thinking a little differently. You know, I used this cover the New York Times from about a month ago in my talk in Web 2.0 Expo New York, because it was great because it had sort of the first warning signs of these big, you know, financial shocks we've seen, but it also had news of the hurricane in Galveston, which was a great reminder of natural disasters and some of the possible effects of climate change. And you go, boy, this is pretty serious news. And you have to start saying, gosh, have we been living in a bit of a bubble in the technology world? And I don't mean an investment bubble, I just mean a reality bubble. You know, we've got the worst income equality in the modern culture since the Gilded Age of the 1920s. You know, we've got oil price shocks, we've got global warming, we've got decline in science, literacy, and education, we've got water scarcity looming, you know, we've got exotic diseases cropping up every few years. You guys have already forgotten about SARS and bird flu, but, you know, the next one's going to come around the corner soon, and then we'll be, you know, once again afraid of what's happening. We've got aging populations, you know, and you know, soaring health costs. We've got a decline in economic competitiveness, and we've got dysfunctional political systems. These are real and serious problems. Meanwhile, our best and brightest are working on things like this. And maybe even cool applications like this. You know, I mean, now I have to say the iPint is a cool application because it sort of shows off this idea of, you know, what we can do with sensors, and I do think that that's one of the important trends for the future that you should all be paying attention to. You know, we are moving into a world in which computing is becoming ubiquitous and driven by not just by people typing on keyboards, but by applications that literally can understand and respond to their environment. And I think there's going to be some amazing new applications possible, particularly when you think about the data that's generated by things like location. You know, when your phone knows where you are, when your camera can start to build 3D models based on just you know, the pictures you take. There's some pretty interesting things happening. But it's tough to predict the future. You know, we have Ray Kurzweil telling us that the singularity is near. You know, technology is going to progress so fast that we're all going to be uploaded into our machines before we die, right? And we'll live forever. Meanwhile, we have, you know, Wall Street fears for the world's next Great Depression. There's a discipline in business for thinking about things like this. It's called scenario planning. And it's actually a fairly interesting discipline that I became familiar with over the last few years. And it started a lot in the oil industry. And this is an illustrative scenario that they use to teach the practice. And they start with some pictures of scenarios for the sale of oil drilling equipment in the US. Now, you probably all recognize, if you're an entrepreneur, graphs like that from your business plan. You know, you have a worst case, you have a middle case, and a best case. Well, here's what really happened to oil equipment in the 1980s. Okay, the worst case was so much worse than they had ever dreamed. And it was a case of what, you know, Nassim Taleb has called a black swan. It turned out that the investment in oil drilling equipment in the US was driven by a loophole in US tax law that made it very attractive as an investment for you know, dentists and lawyers and doctors to invest in oil and gas drilling. Well, they closed the loophole and the market went to hell. So in scenario planning, they said, well, gosh, what we need to do is figure out how to get companies better at thinking about really extreme scenarios, not just variations of the same positive scenario. So to give you an example, you know, we can imagine on one axis the singularity, and on the other axis, global economic and environmental collapse. You know, we can imagine politics as usual, we can imagine visionary leadership. And then we can ask ourselves, depending on which of those things happen, what kinds of strategies should we employ that will be robust in the face of any of those scenarios, right? So you find a zone where you say, well, this is a good thing to do even if we are heading for the singularity. This is a good thing that we should do even if we are heading for a global economic collapse. What are those things? And for me, robust strategy number one is to work on stuff that matters. You know, if you really think about how many of the applications that are being built today are being built because somebody thinks they can get it funded, because somebody thinks that they can get it sold, they're not thinking about, gosh, does this really matter to some, user population, it's yet another social network, yet another, search engine. We don't need more of those. We need innovative thinking working on stuff that matters, hard problems that are unsolved. So when I give you an example of thinking about this, let's take global warming. And I really want to applaud you in Europe and hope to stiffen your spines, because you guys have been a leader on this, but I've been reading in the news that some of the European ministers are starting to pull back on some of the global warming commitments in the face of the economic concerns, and I hope you don't. But if you look at global warming as an example, this is a slide I got from a guy named Kevin Sirache, who's an entrepreneur in energy efficient materials. But he looks at global warming, he says, look, there's 4 different possibilities. We don't know which of these is true. There's no climate change, or yes, there is serious climate change. And we act or we don't act. And you look at those scenarios, and in one case, there's no climate change and we've invested some money, but we still invent new technology. We reduce our reliance on oil. Not too bad. The worst case, billions die, there's large wars. What should we do? And it's pretty clear what we ought to do. That's the robust region, where we do those things. It's good whether there is climate change or not. And this is kind of a modern version of something called Pascal's wager. Back in the 17th century, the mathematician and philosopher Blaise Pascal put forth an argument for belief in God. And the argument went like this. If you believe in God and you're worried about going to hell, you're going to live a good life. You're going to be, virtuous, and you're going to take care of your neighbor, and you're going to do all these things that are called for. And guess what? If there is no God and there is no hell, you've lived a good life, you've been a good citizen, all these good things have happened. It's a better bet, right? Because even if you're wrong, you've done the right thing. And to me, there's a modern version of Pascal's wager, except it's the opposite. It's like if we assume that the world is going to hell in a handbasket, if we assume the worst, I think we're much better off in the choices we make than if we assume, oh yeah, everything's going to be great, everything's going to be happy. So I think we actually are being given a favor by the current downturn and the current threats. It's forcing us to think about what matters, forcing us to be more thoughtful about what we do and why we do it. So when we look at the world's biggest problems, things like, climate change, peak oil, water crisis, species extinction, diseases and the like, we might say, how can I make any difference? And there's a wonderful quote from Elliot Janeway, who wrote a history of the industrialization of America during World War II. And it struck me as a wonderful quote for Web 2.0, for open source. He said, a victory small enough to be organized is too small to be decisive. What a wonderful, wonderful image. And so there was a call out, to everyone to do their part, their small part, and it all added up to something. And so we see that today bubbling up in projects, in startups, in the work of individuals. So Witness.org, a group that's providing digital cameras and infrastructure to people who are documenting human rights abuses around the world. Here's a great example. James Buck was an activist and working with activists in Egypt. He managed to Twitter this one word when he was arrested, right? And that's what probably saved his life. People who are using Google Earth to track illegal deforestation in Brazil. Here's a guy I just read about in the New York Times this morning, as in the International Herald Tribune this morning. This guy has running something he calls the Biblio Bureau. He was a guy who was fortunate enough to get out of a small village in Colombia, become educated, and now he has a traveling library. He owns 4,800 books, and he goes around on donkey back, and he takes these books out to a remote village to share the gift of literacy with people in the region that he came from. This is a wonderful, wonderful gift to the world. He's doing something really important. But there's also tools that we can start to see the power of Web 2.0 to be applied to serious real-world problems. There's a group called Instead, long acronym, I can't remember it. I think it's Innovative Support to Emergencies, Disasters, and Diseases. And it's trying to use collective intelligence techniques to build infrastructure to respond to outbreaks of rare diseases, to disasters and the like. Funded by Google.org, fantastic organization. Same thing, the Global Viral Forecasting Initiative. Same thing, they're trying to look at the emergence of rare diseases. And the internet gives amazing power to do early detection of these things, because that's what will really help us when these diseases break out, is catching it early before they spread. Ushahidi, an open source project that's using mobile phone infrastructure to respond to disasters. It's a Swahili word, a project in Africa. The Open Prosthetics Project is an open source hardware project involved in sharing information about how to build better prosthetic limbs. The open source hardware in general is really interesting, because we're starting to see the rise of really the principles of participation and sharing, applying not just to soft things like software or content or web applications, but literally to stuff. But I also want to really make the point that the great challenges we're facing are also a great opportunity. It's not just something for nonprofits. Existing businesses are starting to catch on to this. Now, since I'm here in Berlin, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Berlin airlift. It's something that I found a fascinating piece of history. You guys may know the history better than many Americans, but just really struck me how amazing it was. You know, back when they decided that, you know, the Soviets were blockading Berlin, and, you know, your parents or grandparents needed to be fed, and they said, oh my God, there's no way we can do this. It's impossible. And yet, somebody made this impossible commitment. You know, this impossible commitment to keep this city supplied by air. And when you read the history, it's absolutely astonishing. You had one flight landing every 2.5 minutes, 24 hours a day for 15 months. You know, that's like amazing. And at the time, you know, we didn't have a well-developed aircraft system. We didn't have cargo aircraft. Right? They actually had to develop the techniques of air traffic control that, you know, are still used today. They had to develop new kinds of cargo aircraft. And, you know, there were people who really put their lives on the line. There were quite a few pilots who died. And this is another one. You know, the planes were unloaded by local volunteers. You know, you had 10 tons, the record was 10 tons unloaded in 10 minutes, you know, by this swarm of people here in Berlin. But my point is, you know, so we look at that, and it was this sort of huge challenge, and yet out of it came many, many companies. You know, you look at the basis, ultimately companies like Boeing and Lockheed really profited from this. They learned their business, and ultimately we see it as the basis for future air traffic companies like FedEx. But kind of going back, there are many companies that are doing some interesting hybrids between profit and nonprofit. There's a startup, there's a company called Benetech that actually funds businesses that are nonprofits, but they're all expected to make money. They're just serving small markets that are typically underserved. You know, things like book sharing for the blind, or Witness, I think, is another one of their projects. Omidyar Network is doing the same thing. Pierre Omidyar, when he took his money from eBay, he set out originally to fund nonprofits, and then he realized that he could actually make more of a difference by funding for-profit companies that had identified possible markets where they could really make a difference. You know, Google.org. Google.org is not a nonprofit. It's part of Google. Google has understood that solving some of these problems, investing in areas like early disease detection or investing in energy, are actually good for their company. You know, it's part of their R&D. Even projects, I know, you know, open source here in Europe, you know, this, the Extremadura Linux project, which has since been followed by other projects here in Germany. You know, the investment, this is an impoverished region in Spain that said, we're going to really take open source software and we're going to use this to increase literacy and technology access in our country. This big problem, great opportunity. Global warming, a startup in the UK called MA, which is really trying to do web services for carbon exchange, data exchange. They're an interchange, really interesting company. Actually, by the way, there's a talk here at Web 2.0 Expo I want to tout for Thursday on the idea of how could we apply Web 2.0 principles to reinventing power grids so that we could make smarter power grids. Great opportunity. In the context of global warming, I also want to point out a site that's created actually by my son-in-law, called watson.org. He's doing a lot of research on climate change. And he points out that in the US, you're a little better in Europe, but still not good enough. We live what you could call a 1,200 watt lifestyle. And that is, if you add up all the energy we use in the products we consume, not just the explicit energy, we're running the equivalent of 120 100-watt light bulbs 24 hours a day to support our lifestyle. That's sort of a light bulb equivalent. Well, if we had our fair share of the world's energy, we'd only get 22 light bulbs, right? Now, you in Europe, I think, it's different country by country, but I think here in Germany, it's something like 800 or 900 watts, but a long way from where it needs to be. And so taking that 2,200 watt, fair share, you start doing things like this. He did this amazing analysis of the embodied energy in a soft drink container. And it turns out that all of the energy that it takes to make that plastic water bottle and to transport it to you is 5% of your fair share of your average daily energy allowance. And yet we throw those things away so casually. And I mention that because energy accounting is going to become a huge challenge in the years ahead. And guess what? It's the kind of problem that Web 2.0 is really good at, managing massive amounts of data. So as we tackle a problem like climate change, there's going to be huge opportunities for people like you. Financial markets. There's a wonderful book by a guy named Richard Bookstaber called The Demon of Our Own Design, which talked about the perils in financial markets. Well, financial markets gone awry are also a tale of how collective intelligence can go awry. Because, of course, financial markets have been applying many of the same principles of Web 2.0. They're networked, they're highly networked, lots of money sloshing around, they're bad actors. What can we learn from these guys? Can we fix the financial system with what we've learned from Web 2.0? Can we fix Web 2.0 with what we learned from financial markets? Politics. There's a post today on the O'Reilly Radar by Josh Ross where he talked to the founder of Blue State Digital, which is one of the leading companies that's actually doing the fundraising for Barack Obama. And it's just a lot of interesting reflections on, now that we've got millions and millions of people contributing to our political system in a very, very different way than any time in the past, do you think those people are going to quit once the election is over? No, we're starting to see the beginnings of electronic governance. We saw already Obama change his position on the campaign financing, got a big blowback from his community. So I think that's going to be really interesting. And again, big opportunities there. MySociety.org in the UK has built really interesting sites about how do you get at the UK government. In the US, the ChicagoCrime.org mashup, which was one of the first mashups, have migrated into a startup called EveryBlock, which is taking government information and building useful services against it. So I think government transparency, huge opportunity. Huge opportunities. This is a company called Click Diagnostics that's using mobile phones to take diagnostics out into third world countries. Prosper, peer-to-peer lending, Patients Like Me, social networks for people with diseases being able to get together. 23andMe, company that was co-founded by Sergey Brin's wife, that's actually trying to aggregate genetic data. Getting rich people to put get their genes sequenced, but ultimately to build a large database for clinical trials. So that leads me to what I would call robust strategy number 2, which is whatever you do in your business, whatever you do in your startup, think about creating more value than you capture. That's a statement that we use internally at O'Reilly. There's a lot of startups that are focused on, how do I make money? How do I get the big payday? And the really successful startups are thinking about how they can create value for other people, for their customers, for their users. And the payday for themselves is a byproduct. So if you focus on that, you think very differently about economic opportunities. And also say that visionary companies are not afraid to make bold commitments to big, hairy, audacious goals. It's a statement from a book called Built to Last, which is a great book about how do you build a great company. And give you some examples. IBM's original forecast for the IBM PC 240,000 units over the lifetime of the device. Meanwhile, these scruffy kids, you might recognize them. There's Bill Gates down in the lower corner. There were just a dozen of them. And they thought, no, we're going to have a PC on every desk and in every home. That was a huge goal. We forget today, when Microsoft started, they weren't a giant company. They weren't, Bill Gates wasn't the richest man in the world. He was a scruffy kid starting a company, and he thought he could do something that was really big and really important. Similarly, meanwhile, the titans of industry at the time said the PC is just a toy. 1998, search had been written off as a business opportunity. These guys said, we're going to organize all the world's information, right? Do you think we're done yet? Do we think we're done yet? I don't. So I want to leave you with a poem that I've been sharing with audiences throughout this year. I started back in March, so I guess that makes me a prophet. As you'll hear, it's a poem from one of your poets, and I know you guys some of you may have read it in the original. I'm reading it in translation. It's called The Man Watching by Rainer Maria Rilke. And it's basically about Jacob wrestling with the angel, story from the Old Testament. He says, I can tell by the way the trees beat after so many dull days on my worried window panes that a storm is coming. Well, maybe it's coming, and maybe it's actually arrived now. He says, the storm, the shifter of shapes, drives on across the woods and across time, and the world looks as if it had no age. The landscape, like a line in the psalm book, is seriousness and weight and eternity. Now, this is the part that I love. What we choose to fight is so tiny. What fights us is so great. And then he goes on, when we win, it's with small things, and the triumph itself makes us small. What is extraordinary and eternal does not want to be bent by us. I mean, the angel who appeared to the wrestlers of the Old Testament, when the wrestlers' sinews grew long like metal strings, he felt them under his fingers like chords of deep music. Whoever was beaten by this angel went away proud and strengthened and great from that harsh hand that kneaded him as if to change his shape. Winning does not tempt that man. He grows by being defeated decisively by successively greater beings. So that's really the challenge I want to leave you with. Tackle problems that are so hard that you don't know if you can solve them. Tackling big problems will not only make you great, it will make the world great. And that's the challenge that we have today, and I hope you will join me in taking it up. Thank you very much.